smells.
There
Get
is
out my whip.
This is the Mark II.
Ah. In Japanese?
No. In my kids' school.
Ah, okay. in Scouts in Italy, it's this. Okay, theoretically here we have an hour, and it's a sort of introduction to me, the way you guys interviewed each other. This is me presenting who I am and where I come from. But an hour is a long time, so I would really appreciate it if you interrupt me when you have questions. And I did not prepare an hour-long presentation, so when something's unclear or you'd like to add something, please interrupt. Don't hesitate. And originally Doreen was supposed to be here. She's the writing genre expert. I'm the language expert. So everything that I'm going to present about me are language courses, because that's what I do. What I've done then is, after I talk about what I've done, I've taken 2 other courses, which are writing courses, and I'll talk to you about those. Obviously, I can't answer questions in the same way because they're not my courses, but hopefully I hope that by talking to you about what I've done, what other people have done, it'll give you ideas or bring up issues and questions that will help you carry your courses forward, okay? Okay, so this is going to be just a very brief history of GNLEs. I think it's come up in conversations today. Obviously, there is a close relationship between technology and GNLEs because they're interrelated. It's the technology that carries it forth, but it's also the pedagogy, and I mean, you have to look at the progression together. So just to start with this, do you see this? At the bottom it says, Grandpa, tell me about the days when people had pen pals, not e-pals. Okay, so nothing. Much of what we're doing today is not necessarily different from what was done before, because some of us might have had pen pals when we were children, for example, either with other children in the United States or abroad. It's that technology has allowed us to do it in different ways, right? So now, today, instead of pen pals, young children today might have e-pals. So you have this communication using email. And historically speaking, that was kind of the first way that people really started using technology in education for communication, was through email. And people are still doing it because it works. Then we had the advent of these learning platforms. So there was Blackboard and WebCT and Moodle. And this was heralded as, changing the way people learn and online education, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem here is that, and still continues to be in my opinion, the pedagogy doesn't adapt as fast as the technology does. So what happened in the first decade of these platforms was that people were taking what they do in the classroom and simply transferring it online. Whereas it's actually the pedagogy and the things you do online in many cases have to change, okay? And then as bandwidth grew and technology improved, video and video conferencing entered the ballgame. But at first it tended to be video conferencing group to group because there still weren't the opportunities to do it 1-to-1 or 2-to-2. And then other programs came out, like Skype, for example, in which people could easily, even with a relatively low bandwidth, talk to one another. And so Skype, for example. And then today, people are actually using virtual worlds like Second Life. So not only talking to one another and seeing one another, but being an avatar in a virtual world and interacting through your avatar with other people. Okay? Now, language learning is one of the first areas, I think, in education in general, that really took advantage of the opportunities for this type of international collaboration, because language learning is all about communication. I mean, it's one of those evident areas where it's important for people to communicate. And in particular, talking to colleagues, I think, almost completely around the world. The one thing that students don't have the opportunity to do in the classroom is speak, right? We all learn the grammar, we learn to write, we learn to read, we learn to listen. What we never have opportunities to do enough of is speak. Speak in authentic situations using authentic language, because you ask, you know, in a class in America, I'm studying French, they tell me to look at my other American friend and speak to her in French. There's nothing more awkward or unnatural about that, okay? There's nothing authentic about it. So language learning really was one of the first areas where particularly audio and video communication became really important because it gave people the opportunity to do speaking. I was lucky enough to have colleagues in Padua who started doing these kinds of exchanges 2002, 2003. And so then in 2005, 2006, I started doing my own exchanges. And almost all of the exchanges I did at first were bilingual. So I would have a school in Italy, a school in the United States, and we would, and they were university students on both sides, more or less the same age, although the American students tend to be younger. And they would be bilingual exchanges where students, the sense of reciprocity, so you speak in both languages, you write in both languages, etc. And then I did the same thing, but with Dickinson College, because another thing that's obviously very important is finding the right partner. And my partner in Dickinson proved to be a wonderful, very reliable partner, much more so than my colleague in Tulane. And so I did 4 or 5 iterations with my partner in Dickinson. And those were very good exchanges. And then, starting in 2009, I moved a bit away from the bilingual and decided to do exchanges between students in Italy and students in Germany using English as a lingua franca. And then, and the 2 cohorts changed because in Italy, they were university students. In Germany, they were university students, but at the master's level, training to be language teachers. So a different cohort. And then, since I like to complicate my life, last semester, we did an exchange using English, but with students from Italy, Amsterdam, Hebron, and Jordan. And so there, again, it was to kind of move out. When we did Germany, Italy, it was very nice, but it was Europe, and we wanted to move out of Europe and into the Middle East. And so we had an exchange, a 4-way exchange with 4 different countries. So that's what I've been doing in the past 5 years, and I'll talk a little bit about those now. So first of all, what communication tools are you going to use? Did I decide to use? Well, as I just said before, primarily speaking was what interested me. And unlike many of you here at American universities, we do not in Italy have a learning management system. We do not have money for any kind of proprietary software. And Skype is a great tool and it's free. So, and it's easy for students to install on their own computers. It's convincing technicians to install it on the university computers was a challenge because they saw Skype as being a fun thing. But after a little convincing, and going back to what John was saying about administrators and trying to convince people that we were able to convince them. So Skype was what we used for the synchronous communication. But then we had the issue of, well, where are we going to post course calendars and the asynchronous tasks and have forums, etc. And I decided to use a wiki. Do we all know what wikis are? If you do not know what a wiki is, raise your hand. So we all know what wikis are. Basically, I mean, if you look at it right there, that was our wiki for the 4-way exchange. It looks like a web page, right? There are links here and there. And so we use the wiki pages for like a platform for the course. And then they also use the wiki for their collaborative writing assignments. So basically the 2 tools I've used for the past 5 years have been Skype and a wiki. The wiki is a free wiki. It's called PB Wiki. And they're really helpful, and when I've been using the same wiki with all the different exchanges, so they're all there on the same platform. And when I didn't have enough space yet, I wrote to them and said, we're willing to pay for more space. And they said, oh, you're such a good user, we'll just upgrade you. So I've been using it for 5 years for free, so it's a good service. But we also use lots of different Web 2.0 tools. Because, one, because lots of students are using them anyway. 2, because they're free. 3, because they offer different modes of communication and different opportunities for communicating in different ways. So we use wikis, we use blogs, we use Skype, we use various online forums, and also questionnaires. I'm sure you're familiar with SurveyMonkey and Blogger. I mean, do some of those look familiar to you?
Some.
Okay, some. And they're all free, again. Okay, so that's gonna, I don't want to beat it down too much, but I think I'm an American, but I work in Italy. And so in some ways I'm bringing, I would like to bring to the front issues that might occur in other countries that are not the way they are here, okay? I mean, in many countries in Europe, higher educational institutions of higher education are state-run. They don't have the same kind of financing, and so your access to resources is a bit different. Okay, so I'm going to just show you a few slides about the Padova-Dickinson exchange. This is one I did several years. Dickinson College is in Pennsylvania, and there, what we were saying about Kalamazoo before, Dickinson, I think, has one of the highest rates of students who study abroad as well. Okay, so in one of the iterations we did, we decided to have forum discussions in a blog, and so we would alternate weeks. 1 week it would be a discussion about American culture in English. So the American students would be writing in English about their own culture, and the Italian students would be writing in English, asking questions about American culture, and vice versa. Okay? Now, we would post prompts, and then the American students would, for example, if it was in English, they would explain their opinion or ideas on that prompt. For example, one was immigration, and so we asked them questions about immigration in the United States. And then the students in Italy would pose questions to them, and the American students would reply. The topics that we chose in that iteration were primarily based on the Dickinson syllabus due to institutional constraints in the U.S. This was one of the main problems with Dickinson, which will come up later in the presentation. Some flexibility was achieved through teacher negotiation, but my colleague in Dickinson, she had to publish her syllabus in the spring for the fall, and it was very difficult for her to adapt that in any way. And the other thing that happened was that in her case, in her courses, our exchange is always an add-on, whereas in Italy, in my class, it's the only thing we're doing. So her students are going to class 5 days a week, and in addition to that, they're doing an exchange. Whereas in Italy, mine come twice a week, and one of those days it's exchange. So there's a really big imbalance there, which obviously influences student participation, for example. And so this was a blog. So a blog you can set up basically like a forum, because we would put the prompt, and then using the comment function, they would provide their comments below, okay? Another thing that sometimes is difficult to convince administrators of, or your head of the department, is if this is an English language class, why are my students writing to the Americans in Italian? In other words, why are my students wasting time in their foreign language class writing in their own language? And there are two justifications for it. One is culture, because you're learning and talking about culture. And the other is that you can really own their theories. Are any of you familiar with Cultura? It's a program at MIT that's been running since the end of the 1990s. Their exchanges are actually the students always write in their own language. They never ever write in the foreign language, okay? So it's very extreme. We had to achieve a compromise here where they were writing in both languages. Cultura is you never write in the foreign language, because the idea is that you can really only express your cultural ideas and where you're coming from in your native language. That the minute you start trying to communicate something about your culture in a foreign language, you're not communicating it in the same way, okay? Now the benefit is that you can learn a lot by reading what your American peers are writing in English or in Italian, okay? So I'm an Italian student. My American peers are writing in Italian. By analyzing their Italian, you can see what's happening in English beneath, okay? The structure of a sentence or the the way they put a noun and an adjective, or the way they conjugate a verb, etc. Okay. So this was our compromise, was that in each session, students have to talk at least 25 out of 50 minutes in Italian. Okay? My idea was to do 1 week in Italian, 1 week in English, but that didn't go over with her administrators, Dickinson, so we did half of the conversation in English, half in Italian. This means the Italian students will have to learn to be understanding with their lower level American peers. The Italian students were in their 3rd or 4th year of English and had done it to a certain degree at high school. The American students were in their 2nd or 3rd semester of Italian. So they need to learn to be understanding with their low-level American peers, and the American students will have to have the courage to throw themselves into the language, even if they have limited vocabulary. So those were kind of our indications on both sides, how to approach the fact that there is not an equal level of proficiency. And in Skype, there is always the text chat function that can be used when there are misunderstandings. And they use the text chat a lot. And students also always had a dictionary open, so that if they couldn't find the right word, they could always go to the dictionary, which is one of the benefits of using something like Skype, because then they have a browser open where they can do a whole bunch of different things that they feel they need to do to improve the communication. So this is a screenshot of what the calendar looked like in the wiki. I mean, to a certain degree, how many of you use learning management systems? Okay, most of you. So, to a certain degree, this is nothing more than the blocks that you might find, the modules, the blocks that you might find in the learning management system, okay? I have the week, the topic, and then various tasks that they are supposed to do. Just as we said today, it was nice that you all knew something about each other before you actually had to meet each other today. One of their first tasks is to post introductions about themselves on the wiki, so at least you know who you're dealing with. The other thing we have them do is to write questions, because the first time they go online, the first time a student goes online and has to speak in a foreign language with somebody they've never met, it's extremely intimidating. So if you have some questions that you can fall back on, it gives you some sense of security at least. And this is also something we do. We don't have each student write their questions and keep them. We do it collaboratively, all on one page, so students can fish from the questions or ideas for questions that other students had as well. And that's one thing that's nice about using a platform or a wiki, that you can have students collaborate and develop those kinds of things together. From a linguistic point of view, for language teachers, something as simple as this is really interesting, because the Americans were writing in Italian, and the Italians were writing in English. And just by looking at the way they structure their questions and the words they use, or for example, you know, one American student asked about when their rottura di primavera. Does anybody get that? Rottura means break, but in a sense of like physical break. So they asked when their break of spring was. Okay? And you know, the Italians read it, and they're like, what is that? And that's not only a linguistic issue, that's a cultural issue. We don't have spring break in Italy. They didn't even understand what spring break was. What's that?
Yeah.
So from very simple things, and you know, recorded on a wiki, so you can go back and look at it with the students, you can, I mean, from very simple things, start learning things about the other culture. And then they would do this, then we have time in class to talk about it, and then they can go off and have their Skype conversation and discuss it with their peers. And in this particular iteration, what we did is we compared films, and we compared 2 films about the mafia. It's Italy, you know how it is. And one was The Godfather, which is about the Italian mafia in New York, and the other was I Cento Passi, which is about the Italian mafia in Sicily, in Italian. So again, they were watching a film in English and a film in Italian. And based on their very different films, it's really interesting. For example, Cultura often does, you know the film 3 Men and a Baby? The original is French. So they watch, or Nikita is another example, the film Nikita. So there, it's the same film done in America and redone in America. Here it wasn't the same film, but it was about the same topic, and the differences were just striking. And so again, it teaches you, you're not only doing language, you're doing lots of culture, just the way the film was filmed. And discussing the films, this led to further topics of discussion, such as crime, immigration, the Italians being in New York, the mafia being immigrated to New York, politics, family, etc. And then students were placed in groups of 4. They had to choose a topic for collaborative text that was half in English, written by the Italian students, and half in Italian, written by the American students. Students discussed the project in Skype, and then they provided peer feedback on the wiki. And this is where things get a little tricky. So what you have is an Italian student writing in English and their American peer correcting their English. And the whole issue of correcting somebody else's work is not easy in any situation. I mean, for me, it's very easy with a very close colleague. But even a colleague who's not a close colleague, I start worrying about how much you want to correct, how much you want to intervene, these sorts of things. So we found, sorry, there's some water. We have found over the years that this is something that needs to be discussed between partners before they even do it. Because there are cultural issues about how you correct, but there are also personal issues about how to correct. So, and the nice thing about using a wiki is that you can see what people have done. A wiki gives you a history of every change that is made. So just for example here, it's a very simple example. You don't have to be able to read the words, okay? The top is the final text, what the Italian student wrote in English. Below, you see the red is what the American student crossed out, and then the green, what the American student wrote in. So as teachers, we can actually follow how our students are providing peer feedback, okay? And one of the other problems with doing peer feedback with Americans is that Americans don't always know their grammar very well. That's one problem. The second problem is that Italians very much have been taught British English. And we've had some really difficult situations where, the Italian is trying to convince that color can be spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, and the American student is insisting that there's no U in the word. And, so, again, there could be.
So I'm just really curious about this, so I hope it's okay to interrupt and just ask you. So the American student has corrected the Italian student's English, and employment. So my students make the same mistake again. So is there feedback provided to the Italian student about why we don't say an employment, but we just say employment? Because it's one thing to just correct it, but then does the Italian student know anything about why that's wrong and how to avoid making that same mistake again?
One thing is that this is something that students decide in their pairs, like I said before, because some students want to know why and would like to discuss it. Others feel uncomfortable doing that and prefer this.
Because I think for most American students, they would know to cross out an employment. But then if you ask them to explain to an Italian why we don't say an employment, they would have no idea how to explain why we don't say that.
They don't know count and uncount.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. The benefit of being a blended course is that you have time in the classroom where you can go through it with your students. I did the exact same thing we'll see a little later on with the German students who were training to be English teachers. Now there it was easier because they were training to be teachers of English as a foreign language, so they were capable of explaining. Here with the American students, it tends to be better to do just this.
Mm-hmm. Did the Italian students, and vice versa, did the students find this useful to have their work corrected by someone who couldn't explain to them why?
But see, the Italian students know why.
Oh, but the English students don't know why.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's true too. My experience, I find the same thing. Yeah.
The Italian student, they look at unemployment and say, oh, unemployment.
They say, oh, non-count.
Exactly.
And the Americans say, what?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Which is one of the benefits of the monolingual exchange, is that they're both students of the language. Whereas Italians are probably capable of explaining their own grammar system to another person. American students are not.
There, right.
So. But on each wiki page, there's the comment section. So, for example, in the German exchange, they could provide explanations as to why they were doing it. And, of course, this is going on every week in an iterative process, so if they don't understand something or whatever, they want to talk about it, they have Skype the next week. So they take note of it.
But did you leave that pretty much up to the students for how much feedback they wanted and were able to give each other? Yeah, okay.
But this was the final project, so it was pretty important to make sure it was correct. Okay, these are just, I just threw these down. There are many other. These were the lessons learned in these few years I've been doing the Dickinson Exchange. I think it's really important to have the synchronous and the asynchronous because they get the writing component through the wiki and they get the oral component through using Skype. And in a language course, of course. But even in creating relationships, as we were saying this morning, there are two different modes. They lend themselves to different kinds of thinking and different kinds of tasks. Skype is easy to use and reliable. I mean, it really is. I've been using it for years and it just never fails. And there's free software for recording them, so all of the Skype sessions are recorded, and then we upload the MP3 file to the wiki. So the recordings of all their conversations are there. When Skyping, students also are texting, as I said before, and students are learning language and culture simultaneously. And I say creating new relationships because one word that comes up very regularly in their, they have learner diaries and then they have final evaluations, is my friend, my friends. Okay, they don't say my peer in the U.S., my partner in the U.S. They say my friend. I mean, they really are developing relationships with these people. The bad side is that the workload is too much on the side of America because it's an add-on. And so the Italian students are often frustrated that their peers in the United States aren't doing as much. The learning curve for the wiki is a bit higher than the learning curve for Skype. And we would theoretically need more time at the beginning of the exchange to really help them understand how to use the wiki. It's not difficult, but you just need to do it. And one other problem with many of these exchanges is there's never enough time because calendars aren't right. So you find those 4 weeks or those 6 weeks where they can Skype every week. And the Americans have already been going to school for, I don't know, a month. So maybe they would have time to do the wiki. But our first session is the first week of our semester. And so there's no time to prepare the student because we don't even know who we're going to have in the classroom until they're there the first day. In Italy, students don't register for courses. You don't know who's going to be there. You don't know how many are going to be there. So all of these logistical problems make it difficult to do things the way you would really like to do them. Okay, and I don't know if this is the case in other countries, but it certainly is in Italy and Spain and France.
Spain,
exactly. Another thing that I eventually found very frustrating is that there was too much dependence on the American syllabus. And though at the beginning I was willing to be relatively flexible because I didn't have a specific content area that I needed to focus on, mine really was just a language class, there was too much leaning towards focusing on Italian culture and not enough of a mix. And I found that frustrating. And peer feedback and collaborative writing require full participation. And if there isn't full participation, students get very frustrated and end up resenting their peers and aren't getting very much out of it. Which goes back to the first point that if it's an add-on, the Dickinson students aren't finding enough time to give feedback. And so it's frustrating for the Italian students. Okay, so I decided to try a monolingual exchange. And one of the main reasons was I wanted to move beyond this dichotomy. What happens in most bilingual exchanges is it ends up being, in America we do this, in Italy we do that, in America we do this, and in Italy we do that. It ends up leading to lots of stereotyping, lots of generalizing, which simply isn't the case. Also, in America and in Italy today, I'd say a third to a half of the students are actually not Native Americans or Native Italians. Huh. In Italy, you have many people from Eastern Europe, from North Africa. You have exchange students. And in America, the immigration is what it is. And we know that not all of our students are native of the United States. And so their identity, for example, being Hispanic American, sometimes gets lost in these generalizing. In America, we do this. At a liberal arts college in America, this is what happens. You lose that personal identity that people might have. And it leads to a wider range of topics. You know, you don't just talk about food in Italy and food in America. Several times the Americans are convinced that pizza is American. And the Italians get so offended, it's really trying to convince the Americans that pizza is actually Italian. And also more relevant topics. I mean, we're dealing with, young adults here, to move beyond hobbies and food and sport to more relevant kind of global issues or political issues that are issues that are affecting their daily lives as young adults who are going to be entering the workplace. And because more communication in English today takes place between non-native speakers than between a native speaker and a non-native speaker, okay? So this communication between Italians and German is actually more common and natural today than me speaking to one of you who's not a native speaker or me speaking to one of you who is. Although it's hard to convince most English teachers that this is the case. And the other advantage is that everything they're doing in this exchange is in English. So they're never writing in Italian. They're doing everything in English. So that's the plus for convincing people that it's a good thing. Everything they're writing and speaking is always in English. And I also have colleagues who are doing this now. I've convinced them. I have colleagues who are doing it with French and colleagues who are doing it with Spanish and a colleague who's doing it with Dutch. So students in different countries in Europe who are studying these languages as foreign language, doing exchanges. And it's less intimidating for proficient students. If you're not a very proficient student in a language and you have to get online, on Skype, and speak to a native speaker, it is terrifying. It's really scary. Whereas when you're going on and you're not speaking to a native speaker, you're, okay, they're a language learner too, not just me. And in our case, it was a good opportunity for the teacher trainees to practice their tutoring skills with the less proficient learners. And it's called a near-peer concept, that the teacher is not a near-peer. The teacher is here and the student is here. Whereas the near-peer often is able to be more effective with the learner because the students don't feel that distance as much as they might necessarily with the teacher. So we had forums, and just to give you a quick idea, we would give them links, and this one was on global citizenship. We would give them links. They had to go watch videos, so that was listening. We would give them an article to read online. That was reading. And then they'd have to write in the forums. They wrote so much more in this exchange than they did in the bilingual exchange. And maybe because it was all in English between non-native speakers, but also because the topics, I think, they just found more interesting. Because, they're 20 years old, 22 years old. This was more relevant to them. And they were very good about, but as Kate Cochran said, about referring back to what people had said and using the forum effectively in that way. Okay, and all students then were asked to report on or reflect on their conversations. So they would write in those discussion forums. Then they would have a Skype session in which they would discuss what had already been discussed in the forum. And then they would afterwards have to write in their learner diaries on the wiki. And then the German teacher trainees were asked to correct the language. So again, you see what you saw before. You have the green, what the German student has added, and red, what the German student has taken away. And one thing that I did find here is that what the German students would often write is, in the comment section, oh, your English is so good, and oh, your English is getting better. And they really tried to support and motivate these Italian students because they did feel less proficient. They were very good at that. Okay, and then for the final project here, we decided to move away from language and to have them do, you don't need to read all this, a collage. Because we talked about being a European citizen. We talked about kind of local identity, regional identity, national identity, European identity. Because, we say European, but none of them really feel European. And if anything, they have a local identity, which is the strongest. So we talked about those kinds of identities, global citizenship. And so we asked them to do a collage. So they had to go online and find pictures or upload their own pictures and then during a Skype session decide which pictures they were going to use in their collage and why. And we came up with these sorts of things. So then they all posted their collages. And since in some ways they were very similar, in some ways they were very different, we also asked them to explain why they had chosen certain pictures and what those pictures meant for their group in the context of that collage. So basically one person was responsible in the end for putting the collage together, and the other students in the group were explaining why they had chosen those pictures. And it was a nice task. So the lessons learned from this is that there was reduced stress because they were non-native speakers. The German speakers were very annoyed and irritated at first that they had to speak to Italians, because the Germans, but I think like many other cultures, we want the native speaker. You know, there's this concept. I can only learn a language from speaking with the native speaker. And it took them a while to accept that, gee, maybe by talking with an Italian for an hour and a half a week, they were actually practicing their English and learning something. And they also had to learn that they had to accommodate the vocabulary they used, the speed at which they spoke, etc., to the Italian students. We had a broader range of topics. It was the same time zone. That was so amazing after years of having 6-hour difference. It was wonderful. And then there was lots of sharing of terms and expressions from students' native languages, which I really thought was nice. Because they were speaking in English, but you know what happens, well, those of you who speak a foreign language, you think of something, and it happens to me all the time, and I say it in English because it's only really said well in Italian, you know? And so they would do that with German and Italian, even though the exchange was in English. So, and there was no requirement you must speak in English the whole time. No, there was lots of flexibility, and they took advantage of it. The negative sides were that it wasn't easy to convince the Germans, and the calendars were very, very different. In the end, we had 6 weeks, 3 of which were vacation in Germany. And so we had students do Skype on their own time, and they did it. They were very responsible, but it's not the same as if you can do it all in the classroom. So, they're both European countries, but their calendars are completely different. Okay, well those are my courses before I go on to the writing. Are there any questions, comments?
I'm not sure. You did the Skype session in class.
In class,
okay.
Yes. I tried.
Not too noisy?
No, because what's interesting is when you see students, they put their headsets on and they start talking, and that's it. The rest of the world no longer exists. They just focus on the computer, and that's it. And lots of smiling. They go in being very nervous, and then all of a sudden they start relaxing, and there's lots of smiling. But no, I tried doing it at home for a while, but it's much less reliable in Italy to assume that students have access to internet. And I also find that, particularly at undergraduate level, they're still relatively irresponsible about doing things. I see a difference at the master's level. So having it planned in the classroom has made a significant difference.
Yeah, that was my question. I'm sorry if I'm repeating, but when you're having them do a synchronous activity like Skype, they're assigned with a partner, it's one-on-one?
Well, it depends on who's present that day, because I've done it all different ways. I've done one-on-one, I've done 2 and 2, I've done groups of 6. Sometimes in some exchanges I actually vary it throughout the exchange because it's a very different kind of conversation. Theoretically, one-on-one.
Okay, and then, but you're saying it's better to have that scheduled, it works scheduled as a class time rather than allowing the students to organize their own time. Yeah, okay.
With the Americans, it's a hassle, and it's a lot more difficult to organize. But if you manage to organize it, I think it runs in a much more effective way. And then at least for the synchronous element, they are doing the same thing at the same time. Now, a few times I would have students maybe who were sick and stayed home, and they would write to me and say, can I Skype from home anyway? And so they would do that, for that day. That was fine. It was nice that fine, you can do it from home that day. But at that, they did it at the assigned time, but from home.
Just a variant, which is to use the class time to schedule the non-class Skype times. I mean, just as it's an intermediate between saying, please Skype with your partners this week or whatever, which often never happens, and taking class time, which might be your only time with them if it's that kind of situation. Sometimes I've had them use a device like a wiki during class where they actually set up schedules when they're going to meet, but they don't actually do the Skyping in class, and that increases the odds significantly that they'll do it, but doesn't take up all the time.
Two questions. One, you only use audio Skype, it looks like.
Yes.
Only audio. And then two, do you model this kind of conversation at the beginning of the collaboration in any way?
No.
So they just work it out?
Did you find that students would just sort of, I mean, how long were these conversations expected to last? Was there?
No, that's another nice thing is that, the ones with the Germany group, it were an hour and a half. And when I first told them that they made the same expression you just made, you know. And when I kind of whistled and said it was over, they were all eyes. Because once they get going, they enjoy it. Now, as far as modeling I've been doing this for a few years, and originally, even with the online forums, there was lots of discussion about modeling. How to write effectively in a forum. How to write an effective forum post. How to have, well, whose opinion is that? I mean, now teaching them, this is what we'll do. This is Betsy. Betsy's just walked in. She'll be with us tomorrow. Yeah. What we'll be doing with Betsy tomorrow is, it's not about what is the right way to write a forum post. It's, I need to be prepared to accept that my partner might be writing a forum post in a different way than I'm doing it. And what's nice about the synchronous conversation is that almost always, I think it almost always works, they figure it out in that pair. And so I am not particularly keen on modeling anymore because that would be of what's appropriate communication. What?
Did they ever get stuck or just run out of things to talk about, or no? Do you feel that did you have to set up a lot of ice-breaking activities in the beginning? No, they just naturally wanted to talk a lot with each other.
What they always do the first session is they text chat for about 10 minutes. Because the idea of...
May I come in with a question from the outside?
Yes.
That nothing spreads quite as fast as mistaken language. Doesn't the language quality ultimately go down?
No.
It's a question because I've heard about some research that ultimately mistakes spread faster than the correct use.
No, that has not been. First of all, that has not been. And I think it's really important to differentiate the objectives and goals of a course, which is, again, what we'll be doing tomorrow. The aim of this course is increasing fluency and confidence in oral communication. And the minute you start focusing on proficiency, you lose that focus on fluency. Now, the benefit of using a forum, in addition to that, and having written work, is that you can focus on proficiency and accuracy in that context. But my experience has not at all been that the level goes down. And it's also true that the German students had a relatively good level of English. But what was interesting was that the German students were convinced that their English was so good. And what was nice is that by recording the Skype conversations, we asked them to go back and listen to their Skype conversations. They were able to identify areas where they themselves had made mistakes. So I think it's how you use it. I mean, in the actual moment that they're communicating, no intervention about accuracy. Then you can use the written work, you can use the recordings of the audio conversations to focus on form and focus on accuracy. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Could I ask?
Nice to hear from you, Dirk.
Yes.
Yeah. The audio recording add-on, is that not, that's something other than Skype? What program do you use?
Skype has a program called Pamela, which we used for a while, but we're pleased with it. We use a program now called MP3 Skype Recorder. It's freeware.
Sounds good.
It's a little box on your computer about that big. It creates a very light MP3 file, which you can easily upload to a wiki in a few seconds.
Is it free?
It's free.
And that's how your wiki space got used up so quickly, I guess, because you've got all
And
these
images.
recordings.
I didn't finish your question though, did I?
I was just curious about how you. It seems like they were just off and running with their
Oh,
partners
no, I was
that
saying
really
about
like to
texting.
talk a lot.
I was saying that they text first. at the
They text
beginning.
first as a kind of icebreaker.
I mean, we do have icebreaker activities, but what it really is just a matter of sitting there and texting. Hi, are you there?
Yes.
What are we supposed to do? Even though they know it, but they want to negotiate it together. And
Uh-huh.
I think that opportunity to be able to text before you actually have to use your voice. I mean, your voice is who you are in a very strong way. So the texting helps, I think.
And through the course of the semester, or did they have different partners for each of these conversations, or did
No,
they
I
keep
try
a
and keep
partner?
it the same partner.
Okay, so they would get to know each other more deeply through that.
Yeah, one semester the two fell in love.
Oh.
We had what we do almost every time is then the last session we have a video conference, just group to group. You should have seen them. Ava! My name was Ava. I finally see you. Oh, Francisco! And they ended up meeting up and visiting each other. The other girls were jealous because she fell in love with the American boyfriend. But what you find though is that, I mean, I've done research on this, the amount of text chat reduces significantly throughout the exchange. That as they become more familiar with one another, they depend much less on the text chat.
I must have missed what you said, but why did you choose only on? Did you focus on the audio?
And not video or not
Why didn't you choose?
video? Number one, because with Skype, especially at the time, you could only do video one-to-one. And we sometimes had groups who were more than one-to-one. Number two, we don't have webcams. And there was no way I was going to convince my university to buy webcams. Number three, I personally hate video Skype. But it's very much a personal thing. I don't like it. I'd rather just have my voice out there. But you see, and it makes me very aware that we're all different. I mean, some people really like the video because you can see the person, and so we have different. But another reason, the fourth reason, is we found doing, for example, the exchanges with Hebron and Jordan, the minute the Italians and the Dutch see the women with the veil or the man with the long beard, they change a little bit. There's something about seeing the person, all those things you have in your head that you maybe would like to think aren't really there, or the assumptions you have about other people, things that come up when you see somebody has a really strong impact. Whereas when it's just somebody's voice, so, I mean, an alternative would be to start out with voice and then move to video if you had the opportunity to do video. Because I know a lot of people who don't like webcams, who don't like sitting in front of a camera. And the other thing with webcams is that where do you look? I mean, have you ever noticed that? You're talking to somebody and they're not looking at you the whole time. Because your webcam is here, but you're looking at the person who's talking to you is here. Right? So how natural that is.
And you have to concentrate on your makeup.
Yes.
That little corner.
You don't want to have to do all that.
But I love what you did with the visual collages. Can you explain more about that assignment and how they physically created and displayed those collages?
Well, one thing I really try and do, in addition to the language, is teach them a lot about how to use the internet, which is what we were talking about at lunch.
Okay.
I focus a lot on the intellectual property rights issues, images being the perfect example. Everybody goes on Google. I mean, it's one thing, I put some images here in this presentation, that I don't have copyright for, I would never publish them anywhere on the web. Whereas people do it all the time. So we do a whole lesson on Flickr, and the Creative Commons licenses. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
They're pictures on a website that you can reuse, and with attribution and other things. So what they do is they either link in the wiki on their group page. They either provide links to those pictures on Flickr, or they actually save them and paste them on the wiki page. So in the end, what we really had, I mean, I can show you if I get internet later, we had these long pages full of pictures, images, and then during the Skype session, they were all scrolling up and down and saying, oh, well, we like this one, that one, I think we should put this in the middle, I think that one should go here, and this is why, and et cetera. And they had 2 sessions to do that. They had 2 sessions for the collage. And then one student put it together. I just suggested Picasa, but then in the end, one student used PowerPoint, one student used something else. So they used whatever software they felt most comfortable with.
Thank you.
Just back to what you were saying before, I just sort of raised a little issue about it. That I think for different people, different situations, things get normalized, whatever it may be. And so I think in terms of Skype, I mean, some people normalize chat, some audio, some video, and I think you have to be a little careful. I know at this point, for myself, I've kind of gone through those 3 stages. I'm not saying video is better, but at this point, I feel really strange having an audio Skype conversation. It feels, what are we ashamed of? I mean, that's almost how I feel. Of course, sometimes it's necessary because of bandwidth or because somebody would prefer to be invisible. But I think they all have their advantages if you can manage them. So.
Yeah. I mean, I said the thing about women in veils, et cetera, but whereas with the American students, I remember they did have webcams one semester. And for my Italian students, it was such a stereotypical, you know, the guys had their baseball hats on backwards and they're sitting like this with their legs open. And they were giggling. They're like, they look just like the Americans in the movies, you know?
Yeah. Well, just one other thing to throw out, which is because it's sort of been a little part of our practice here in the Institute, because we've been using this software, Flash Meeting, which is its own peculiar variant, and it has been offered, and many of you have taken us up on it, so you have access to use it yourself. And I've used that occasionally in classes. It's quite interesting because every student or every person with their own webcam has their own window. So when you have a class, and it only works with a smallish class, you're basically looking at all your students wherever they are, in whatever dress they are, etc. And I found it an incredible window into the lives of my students. Sometimes almost like, do I want to see my students in their nightgown in class because they're not quite calculating how they're presenting themselves. But it's been really, really interesting. And I think a tool, if maybe one that you have to warn your students about. But anyway, so some people might want to explore using that tool, although it maxes out at a total of 25 channels. So if you have a really large group with more than 25 cams functioning at once, you have to pair people up. So.
Well, with Skype, you can actually do more than 2 on video now. But one of the main differences between Skype and Flash Meeting is the way the audio is transmitted. Because in Flash Meeting, it's, I forget what it's called.
Simplex, not duplex.
Simplex, and then Skype is duplex. In other words, Flash Meeting is like walkie-talkie. You have to raise your hand, push a button to talk, that kind of thing. So you can't really interrupt each other. Whereas on Skype, it's more like a normal conversation where you can interrupt one another. Now, again, depending on what your aim is, you might prefer one or the other. In my case of fluency, I prefer Skype because that's more like normal, interrupting one another or interrupting and then stopping. These sorts of things are part of natural conversation. So. Okay, so now just quickly, some of the writing courses. This was one of the really nice case studies in a book I published last year by Brian Carter at the University of Central Missouri. He does everything in Second Life. And this is a quote from the book. Second Life lends itself perfectly to an experiential writing model, which focuses on the personal virtual experiences of a student. All of the essay topics encourage students to venture out onto the SL, Second Life, main grid and experience the topic on which they have chosen to write. Does everyone know what Second Life is?
Yes.
No?
Some of these questions that you ask, my answer is sort of.
Right.
So that's my answer to
Second
this.
Life
It's
is
a
a virtual
virtual,
world.
it's a virtual
Yeah.
world. Yeah.
I know that part,
Okay.
but not very much more than
Okay,
that.
Second Life is a virtual world where there are various islands.
Okay.
Okay? And in fact, right, where are they? Oh yeah, there were two. See, composition 2, business talking, the USA and Sweden, and the USA and France. In this one, the one with Sweden, the course actually took place on Camimo Island, which was an island set up by the university in Sweden to carry out distance learning courses between Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So you pay to have an island, so it is an expense. So the university in Sweden shared their island with the students in the United States, and they had some classes on the island of Camino in Second Life. In the second case, Brian Carter got several grants to develop an island in Second Life called Virtual Harlem, where they have literally gradually rebuilt what Harlem looked like during the Harlem Renaissance. And in fact, that course with the students in Sorbonne involved a lot of building in Second Life. They were actually building the streets and building the buildings collaboratively together in English between the American students and the French students. So it really takes, it wasn't writing together, they were building together in Second Life.
So I'm not familiar with the Carter text, but can you give me a better sense? I mean, you did in one sense just maybe suggest that, but the experience, all the essay topics encourage students to venture out into the
here.
SL main.
I'll tell you here.
Okay.
So, this is the one with Sweden. So you have, all the students have to have an avatar, okay? So you have this online persona who might look like you, might not, might be male, even if you're female, etc.
But wait, just a minute. You generate this yourself. That is, you dress yourself, you create an image of yourself, just to make sure everybody's on the page. And you can make yourself look like a dog, or a pyramid, or a house, or whatever you choose. It's a free-for-all, as it were. So this sense of how you make yourself appear to others is actually part of the world. And it's a whole point of discussion. You know, fat people make themselves look skinny. Skinny people make, well, whatever. We can go on and on. It's very interesting from that question of self.
Well, he's used it. Brian has used it a lot for gender and race.
Right.
That he'll have students, for example, a black student have a white avatar and go out and socialize in Second Life, and then switch to a black avatar and socialize in a similar space and see what the differences are. Because in many ways, Second Life, interaction in Second Life in many ways replicates interaction in the real world because it's behind the avatar, there are people. And you can fly. That's the fun thing in Second Life. It's hard to learn to fly and land, but you can fly.
It may be hard to learn other things. Jaime Wurtzel, who does a lot of cross-cultural work, he tried out Second Life and he visited a mosque, but he had no idea how to remove his shoes in Second Life. So he got into a lot of trouble.
This is one of the many problems of Second Life. And I was thinking something. I forgot. Second Life avatars. When Second Life originally came out, first you could text chat and you couldn't use audio. Now you can use audio relatively easily. And that changed things a lot because, I mean, I remember the first time I met Brian, maybe because I grew up in Baltimore, but I could tell he was a black man instantly just by his voice. I mean, my Italian friends couldn't, but so voice can tell you something about a person. So they've got the avatar, which may or may not be telling you anything about the person. Whereas adding audio and voice to it changes the stakes a little bit. So you had all the students in the US who had their avatars and the students in Sweden who had their avatars. And they met on Camimo Island. They met and they did the getting to know, this is me, how are you, what you all did this morning. Then each of the American students had a topic that they had to write about. They had to talk about cyberfeminism, gender roles, religion in Second Life. So basically the American student would choose places to go in Second Life, and they would accompany their Swedish friend to these places all the time, discussing what they were doing in English. So the American students were researching for their essay. The Swedish students were having conversation in English in Second Life. Does that help a little?
Hey, Sarah, if
Can I
I'm, if
have
I'm,
a little
if I'm right,
split from-
when you say discussing on Second Life, is writing.
No, it was audio, talking. There's audio in Second Life now. They have microphones and a headset. They were talking. And Second Life now, if I'm talking, you can hear me like this right now. If I start walking away, my voice changes a little, right? You can hear me differently. It's the same way on Second Life. Distance changes voice. It's like being in the real world. You can eavesdrop, listen in.
So these two groups of students were actually taking different courses with different course objectives.
Completely.
Okay, that's really interesting.
They just found a way to make. It was the same with I don't think I put it up here. No. The one with the Sorbonne was the same way. In France, it was an English course. In the United States, it was Harlem Renaissance literature.
Mm-hmm.
But they built the space in Second Life together using English.
Brian also has done TechCom. He's done so many projects that it's amazing how fertile I think Second Life could be. It's just kind of weird getting into it.
Yeah.
Have you gone in?
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard to get in. The technical requirements are still pretty hefty. And we tried, and we said you could not do it in Italy right now, as is. I couldn't use it. I mean, Brian and I have talked a lot about this because he's like, it's his religion. He fully believes in Second Life. And, but it's not plausible right now in Padua, so.
Just, I mean, I'm not a Second Life expert, but from being in touch with folks, it seems, just maybe this is unfair, Second Life itself is, stumbling at this point. It seems fewer and fewer people are using it despite the commitment of some, and some alternates are kind of beginning to rise up, which partly are there because they're more public, for one thing, because Second Life is actually owned by a company, and secondly, because they're attempting to do it with a lower bandwidth model, and also to make it a little easier to build, because learning to build things in Second Life, if you can't build anything, then you're sort of stuck with what other people have built, which you generally actually have to pay for. And that becomes, in a classroom, I think, a little problematic beyond the bandwidth issue. So I think it's an evolving area at this point. I think there are actually very few people, although we didn't set any yes or no's as far as applying. I'm not sure if there's actually anyone whose primary modality in this whole institute is using Second Life.
I'm just curious what some of the alternatives are, because I have been interested in it, but I've felt that when I've seen demonstrations of it, I've felt that it's difficult, so I've stayed away from it.
Yeah, rather than offer my really limited insight, maybe we could help you through the comments. I'm trying to dodge a little bit because I don't think I could give you a really good answer. But there are a couple of tools that are really being developed
now.
now.
At some point.
Yeah.
I just want to share because in ESC we did the Second Life, we have a plan, we feel a hope. Because we have a lot of students who are learning on the distance, so they never get to see on campus. So we feel a building, we go on an island, we feel a building is alumni house. So do exactly like our alumni house, we saw the building. You even put a flower there, just look like a picture. So some teacher when they are thinking of Second Life, they can say to students, do you know Second Life? You should know, we can meet in the island. So they feel like they are in the classroom, they are in the teacher, in our actual building, in our actual classroom. And also there are technical limitations like the bandwidth or how familiar you are with Second Life. But we did, this is the one we did, like I say, students feel less of distance, even though we are not international, we are all over New York State or other state. It's a bit, like a plan or strategy. Students feel like it can be in our campus. They can actually see your teacher or your other classmate that just do it every time. That's how we start Second Life.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to just a very important point that we need to constantly remind ourselves of. It depends on what we want to do. Why are we using this tool? If you're using Second Life to do what you could do in a classroom because all your students are on campus and you have a classroom, don't use Second Life. If, in my opinion, if you have students who it would be nice to see what the campus looks like and feel like they're there, then there's a valid reason for using it. I mean, don't use technology if you don't have to.
I was just going to say, my students, I haven't taught in Second Life, but my students have taken me on field trips there. And their chief complaint about it, because they use World of Warcraft and they play virtual games in immersive environments like this. And their chief complaint about Second Life is there's nothing to do there.
Yeah.
So they like World of Warfare and some of those virtual worlds better where they already have characters. And so.
Well, there's Steve Thorne has been doing really interesting research, and Rebecca Black on language learning in the World of Warcraft. And it's just fascinating because it's students who, well, young people who want to go ahead in the game. And to do this, they need the help of other people playing the game. And the only language they have in common is English. And so they're motivated to use English because they want to get ahead in the game. And the amount of text they produce, because it's almost always text-based, is incredible. And he actually has two students, two who learned Russian and one who studied Chinese, so that they could go ahead in the World of Warcraft. Because the World of Warcraft servers where he wanted to play, one was in China and one was in Russia, So, that motivation. Should I stop?
Well, it'll be good to go on to the group work.
Yeah, just so you know, what I didn't say.
Come back to it.
Yeah, it was, I asked Doreen if she could send me some slides of courses she's done, et cetera, et cetera. What she did is she sent me an article. So rather than, which I kind of summarized here in various points, so rather than going through these slides, why don't I just upload the article to the Commons, because I couldn't say anything extra anyway because it's not my course. But for those of you who are doing writing, it was a management communication course. It was a writing course between Canada and Delaware. And can I just end with one thing? She comes up, so all of this comes directly from the paper, so I'll upload it now and you guys can read it. She gives some recommendations, she and her co-author, gave some recommendations for success. And I think this is my last slide. And these I thought were interesting. One is structured interdependence, which is similar to what John was saying about collaboration this morning. Collaboration is depending on one another, but you have to structure it into the way you design tasks, okay? So what they do in their course is that they require field work. So students have to go out into their communities or to a business in their community, do something, find information that their partner in Canada, for example, needs to complete the task. So the partner in Canada can't complete the task unless the partner in Delaware does their part outside in their own community. And it's that, I mean, if you give them kind of research and anybody could go on the web and find the information, there's no interdependence. Whereas in a situation like this, there is. And so maybe like for a final collaborative project, ideas like this are very useful to really set it up so that they need one another. And then here, I agree with some and I disagree with some, and you can give your opinions. Equal treatment. Roughly the same team leadership structure for all teams. So they had 7 teams. 4 had leaders from Delaware, 3 had leaders from Montreal. So equal. They had the same textbooks, the same assignments, and shared key course materials, so everything was the same. They were doing a course together, which in many ways is what you all are proposing, and which is different from what I have done up to now. Equal assessment strategies and grading conditions. That's something we're going to talk about on Sunday. where I disagree, but for practical reasons. But that's something to think about. They maintain that the assessment strategies should be the same. Equal and easy access to all the course technologies, both in and outside class. And as I read this, and just coming from where I come from in Italy, this is not reality. And I'm like, oh wait, it's Montreal and Delaware. Of course you can have equal access. So let's be practical, people. It's not always possible. Okay, I mean, you need to be practical about things as well. And but both classes met in the computer labs, which is what I was saying before. If you can, it's good to get them in the computer lab together. And then peer feedback and mentoring was really important, which is something I agree with and has been done in my courses. For this? Oh no, okay. And that's this afternoon. Okay. So I'm done. Any questions? Just a quick overview.
I wonder if there's a distinction between doing academic courses and sort of preparing them to be successful when they leave the academic environment. Because for some of these things, like especially for Second Life kinds of things, unless you were going into a field where that was actually going to be what would either further your abilities or career, your access to suppliers or to customers or, et cetera, or to peers to be able to work. It's kind of an artificial, we're spending a lot of the precious currency of time on artificial artifices or artificial ways when it seems like it would be much more valuable to the student to use the tools that they are most likely to find immediately effective and be able to bring into the environments that they will be working in.
Well, and the fact is that one of the other benefits of Skype is that most of them have already used it. So that whole training part just disappears because they all know how to use it already. And a recommendation to be careful, you all are familiar with learning management systems. Many students in many countries are not. So there can't be any assumption that the way you build a course in a learning management system or the way you maneuver around a learning management system is some skill that students at that age have, because in Italy they would be lost.
I'm going to say, I can't remember and I can't see your name tag. Mark? Okay, that's good. There's a way in which it might be easy, given that the course that I commonly teach is a first-year writing course, and so it's about literacy practices overtly. That there are ways, for example, that I think some of what may feel in some contexts in some courses as being this sort of artificial structure actually reveals literacy practices that are really, if not important, certainly ripe with issues to talk about. I think at my campus at RIT, they're creating an application called Book Bag, where students can, for any URL-based resource, can put it in their book bag, and a course can have a book bag. And it raises issues of tagging and how you utilize mechanisms of sorting information. So I'm thinking about wikis, and I put something up on the chat there to John's question. But I think, I'm not sure the ways in which wikis or some of these kinds of structures are giving us different kinds of literacy practices that are worth focusing on in an academic writing context. Maybe more in a professional writing context, some of them, or whatever. But I do think, it's a robust question about why to spend the time on a particular kind of technology.
Just jump in to respond also to Mark's question. A lot of these are moving targets. When Second Life was first gaining most currency a couple of years ago, many people were making the case, and many people still do, that this is the way we're going to be working in the future. That the idea that we click and go on this flat world and we think ourselves is going to go away, and that a kind of virtual travel is actually the way it will eventually evolve once the technology is good enough, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure that's true or not, but I think that motivated some folks to look at Second Life as really being the way they would be functioning down the road, and they're prepping for what was coming. Now it's maybe a little more questionable, but So when we're working with technology, I think there's always a tendency to want to be ahead of the curve. I'm not sure it's always the best way for us to move, in fact, but in this case it seems the curve is at least a lot slower wave than a few years ago it looked like it would be.
Yeah, I really think it's a good question, and I value my time as much as anybody. And I'm not jumping into Second Life for my course or collaboration, but I do introduce technologies. For example, I'm using Google Docs for collaboration, and there's, you lose time talking to students about how to use Google Docs and all that, or whatever the technology is. Whether or when we start living in a virtual world and all that kind of stuff, those questions aside, they are presently living in a world where they, in order to survive economically, will need to learn new technologies on an ongoing basis. And if they don't, they will be living in the previous century. So
I think the literacy practices are not necessarily learning how to use a specific tool. What they're learning is learning how to learn to use tools.
Right.
I mean, that's the process. That's what you're really teaching them, because Google Docs is great now, but who knows? They're learning that kind of mental flexibility that will allow them to adapt to these moving targets.
And finding that balance is difficult, I admit, and frustrating for me personally, because I want to be focusing on content all the time. But at the same time, I realize, you know what, when I'm helping them learn how to use the new technology in a way, they are learning something important, even if it's not in the course objectives. This is something essential for them.
Well, it's also an issue, I think, of the learning curve. Because the learning curve for Google Docs or Wiki is relatively easy. The learning curve for something like Second Life is massive. So.
Sure.
Okay. So we'll make the transition to the next session, which are team projects. John, you want to make the comment first? So basically what we're going to do here is give you all a chance to meet in your groups. And of course there are a couple of situations here where your international partner is not present or is going to be reaching us through video. So let me just give the general framing of this. What we really want to do, and we kind of almost started it earlier, but is we want you to break out with your team and have a brief discussion, then come back here and present your project to the group. It's just simply another kind of introduction. As I said, we edged into it already. And we're going to pass this out, which are just some prompts for you to think about when you're meeting with your group. So I'm going to read them because I want to make a point about one. What is your project about? How far along is it? What are the key issues that you feel you face at this point? What are the key issues that lie ahead? Well, that's sort of the same, but just in two time frames. Please shape your responses so they reflect the perspective from faculty, instructional designers, and international program staff. Pick 3 people to speak when you report back. But if there are only 2 people on your team, you can both speak. So the reason for all this, just to sort of decode it, was when we did this at the first workshop, what we found was only one person from each team did all the speaking, and everybody else sat there quietly. And what the other purpose of this, this is a subtext, I'm sort of giving the subtext away rather than asking when you come back, is have you begun to think of yourself as a team? If you're just meeting today, you may not at all. And so one of the things you need to start thinking about is how are you going to work together? And so this is the very tip of that iceberg to start